Some people spend their whole lives searching for proof that kindness is real. Ethan Blackwood decided to test it instead. The great Blackwood estate stood on a quiet hill overlooking nearly 50 acres of rolling green lawns, ancient oak trees, and perfectly trimmed gardens that seemed untouched by time. Every window reflected the pale morning sun like polished glass, and every hallway echoed with the silence of a house far too large for the man who lived inside it. At 38, Ethan Blackwood had built one of the largest investment companies in America, turning impossible risks into unimaginable wealth. Business magazines called him a visionary. Television hosts praised his discipline. Investors admired his instincts. Yet none of them knew the one rule that governed every decision he made. Never trust what people say. Only trust what they do when they believe no one is watching. Years of betrayal had quietly transformed him into a man who questioned every smile and every promise. Employees respected him, but few truly knew him. Even inside his own mansion, conversations rarely lasted longer than necessary. The staff moved carefully, spoke softly, and understood that their employer valued order above comfort. Then, 3 weeks earlier, someone new had arrived. Naomi Carter was 27 years old, a hardworking single mother who accepted the housekeeping position after juggling 2 part-time jobs that still barely covered rent and groceries. She never complained. She simply worked. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, tied back her dark curls, rolled up her sleeves, and quietly restored spotless perfection to rooms most people would have considered already immaculate. Ethan noticed something unusual almost immediately. She never lingered around expensive artwork. She never admired the luxury cars parked inside the climate-controlled garage. She never whispered with other employees about the mansion or its owner. She simply cleaned, organized, smiled politely, and went home. But there was one small complication. Her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, occasionally came with her whenever daycare unexpectedly closed. Ethan had approved the arrangement. Without much thought, assuming the little girl would eventually become another distraction inside his carefully controlled world. Instead, Lily became something entirely different. She wandered through the enormous house with wide, curious eyes, fascinated by ordinary things rather than expensive ones. She laughed at butterflies outside the kitchen window. She waved at gardeners. She thanked every employee who held a door open for her. Even the elderly groundskeeper found himself smiling after she insisted every flower deserved to be told it looked beautiful. Ethan watched all of it through discreet security monitors inside his private office. Day after day, the tiny girl behaved exactly the same whether adults were nearby or not. No tantrums, no grabbing decorations, no touching valuable antiques, just quiet curiosity and endless warmth. It made no sense to him. Children reflected what they learned at home, and adults eventually revealed hidden motives. They always did, which meant one simple question refused to leave his mind. Was Lily truly that innocent, or had no one looked closely enough? The answer, Ethan decided, required one final test. The following afternoon, after every meeting had ended and the mansion settled into its familiar silence, he walked into the grand library, stretched out across the leather sofa beside the fireplace, closed his eyes, slowed his breathing, and waited. The library remained perfectly still except for the quiet ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing near the fireplace. Ethan Blackwood lay motionless on the leather sofa, his breathing slow and steady, every muscle trained to remain relaxed. Through barely opened eyelids, he could see only blurred patches of warm afternoon light stretching across the hardwood floor. Somewhere beyond the tall oak doors, a vacuum cleaner hummed for a few moments before fading into silence. Footsteps approached, then disappeared. The mansion continued breathing around him, calm and predictable. Almost 20 minutes passed before the softest sound interrupted the quiet. Tiny sneakers padded carefully across the hallway. Ethan recognized the rhythm immediately. It was Lily. She was humming to herself, a simple tune without words, the kind only small children invented as they explored the world. Another pair of footsteps followed behind her, quicker and more deliberate. Naomi's voice came softly from the corridor. "Lily, remember what we talked about. Mr. Blackwood may be resting. We never disturb someone who is sleeping." "Yes, Mommy," the little girl answered cheerfully. "I will be very quiet." Ethan listened as Naomi entered another room farther down the hall, likely dusting the nearby study. Lily remained outside the library door. For several long seconds, she did not move. Then the heavy wooden door creaked open just enough for a tiny face to peek inside. Sunlight outlined her curly hair like a soft golden halo as she carefully scanned the room. Her wide brown eyes settled on Ethan sleeping beside the fireplace. Instead of rushing in, she whispered to herself, "He looks tired." She slipped through the doorway, gently pushing it closed without making another sound. Ethan expected curiosity to take over. The library contained priceless sculptures, antique clocks, crystal paperweights, and shelves filled with rare first editions worth more than many families earned in years. A child her age could easily become distracted. Instead, Lily kept both hands folded behind her back as though she had been taught that looking was different from touching. She slowly wandered toward one towering bookshelf, tilting her head while studying rows of colorful bindings she could not yet read. A small globe resting on a polished stand caught her attention. She smiled at it, but never reached out. She spotted an elegant bronze horse displayed on a nearby table and admired it from several feet away before quietly continuing. Ethan felt genuine surprise building beneath his carefully controlled expression. Every movement she made carried remarkable patience. She treated the room with the same respect someone might show inside a church or museum. Then she noticed a framed photograph resting beside the fireplace. It showed Ethan several years younger standing beside an older woman whose warm smile seemed to brighten the picture itself. Lily walked closer until she stood only a few feet from the frame. She looked from the photograph to Ethan's sleeping face and back again. Her little forehead wrinkled with thoughtful curiosity. In an almost inaudible whisper, she asked the empty room, "Is that your mommy too?" There was no answer except the gentle crackling of the fire. Lily smiled anyway, as though silence itself deserved kindness, then carefully sat cross-legged on the thick rug several feet away, making certain she remained quiet enough that the sleeping man would never have a reason to wake. For nearly 5 minutes Lily remained exactly where she was. Her little legs crossed neatly as she watched the dancing flames inside the fireplace. She did not fidget the way most children would. Instead, she seemed perfectly content listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood and the distant chirping of birds beyond the tall windows. Ethan could hardly believe it. He had expected temptation, mischief, or at least restless curiosity. Yet the little girl behaved as though she understood the quiet carried value all by itself. Eventually her attention shifted back toward him. She studied his face with innocent concern instead of childish amusement. His shoulders looked stiff against the leather sofa. A business magazine rested open near one hand, untouched since before he had closed his eyes. Lily slowly rose to her feet, taking tiny careful steps that barely disturbed the thick Persian rug beneath her sneakers. She stopped a safe distance away and folded her hands together. "Mommy says people work very hard when they look tired," she whispered. "Maybe you work too much." Ethan remained perfectly still. Every instinct told him the test was nearly over. She had behaved well. Surely she would quietly leave the room now. Instead, the little girl looked around as though searching for something important. Her eyes landed on the thick knitted blanket folded neatly over the back of a nearby armchair. She glanced toward Ethan once more before carefully walking over to it. The blanket looked enormous in her tiny hands. She tugged once. Nothing happened. She tugged harder, her little face tightening with determination until the blanket slowly slipped free and nearly covered her from head to toe. For a second she disappeared beneath the soft gray fabric before laughing quietly to herself. "You are bigger than me," she whispered to the blanket. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Lily struggled across the room, dragging the blanket inch by inch until she finally reached the sofa. Standing on her tiptoes, she stretched as high as she could. The blanket barely reached over the edge of the sofa, but after several determined attempts, she managed to spread it gently across Ethan's legs. One corner slipped onto the floor. She picked it up without complaint and tried again, smoothing the fabric with both tiny hands exactly the way she had seen her mother make a bed. "There," she said softly with quiet satisfaction. "Now you will not get cold." Ethan felt the unexpected warmth settle over him, but the blanket itself was not what unsettled him. It was the thought behind it. No one had tucked a blanket around him in years. Not since his mother had insisted on doing so whenever he fell asleep reading late into the night as a teenager. The memory surfaced without warning, vivid enough that he could almost hear her gentle laugh echoing through another house, another lifetime. Lily noticed a pair of reading glasses resting crookedly near the edge of the sofa cushion. She picked them up carefully with both hands, walked around to the nearby side table, and placed them there instead. If they fall, she whispered, they might break. She stepped back to admire her work before giving Ethan one final thoughtful look. There was no pride on her face, no expectation of praise, only quiet hope that someone she believed was exhausted would wake feeling a little more comfortable than before. Hidden behind closed eyes, Ethan realized something he had not expected. The little girl had completely forgotten she was being watched because she had never imagined anyone was watching at all. Lily looked around the library once more, as though making certain everything was exactly as it should be before she quietly left. Then a faint sound caught her attention. It was not loud enough to wake a sleeping adult, but to her small ears it was impossible to ignore. Ethan had unconsciously taken a deeper breath, and a slight crease had formed across his forehead. Lily tilted her head with concern. Maybe he is having a sad dream, she whispered. She slowly walked closer again, careful not to let her sneakers make a sound against the polished floor. Naomi often told her that when someone looked worried in their sleep, the kindest thing was not to wake them unless they needed help. So Lily simply stood beside the sofa for a long moment, studying the peaceful rise and fall of Ethan's breathing. Her tiny fingers rested against the edge of the blanket to make sure it still covered him. Satisfied, she smiled softly. Then she noticed something else. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, sending a bright beam directly across Ethan's face. Without saying a word, Lily looked toward the tall windows. The heavy curtains were only slightly open. She remembered watching her mother close curtains whenever bright sunshine made it difficult for someone to rest. The fabric was much too heavy for a 3-year-old to pull completely shut, but she did not give up. She reached as high as she could, gripping one edge with both hands. The curtain moved only a few inches, yet it was enough to soften the sunlight. The harsh beam disappeared from Ethan's face, leaving only a warm glow around the room. Lily stepped back proudly, whispering, "Better." Ethan remained perfectly still, but inside his carefully guarded thoughts, something unfamiliar began to stir. Every action the little girl had taken required effort. None of it benefited her in any way. She expected nothing in return because she believed he would never know she had done any of it. In Ethan's world, kindness usually arrived attached to an invoice, a favor, or a hidden expectation. Investors gave gifts before negotiations. Competitors offered compliments before asking for partnerships. Even charity galas often became opportunities for publicity. Genuine generosity had become so rare that he had almost convinced himself it no longer existed. Yet here stood a little girl whose greatest reward seemed to be believing another person might rest more comfortably. A few moments later, Lily heard Naomi calling from the hallway. "Lily? Sweetheart, where are you?" "I am in the library, Mommy," Lily answered quietly, making sure not to raise her voice. Naomi appeared at the doorway carrying a feather duster, her expression immediately turning apologetic when she spotted her daughter near the sofa. She lowered her voice to almost a whisper. "Honey, we should let Mr. Blackwood sleep." Lily nodded eagerly and hurried toward her mother, but before leaving she glanced back one last time. "Mommy," she whispered, gently tugging Naomi's sleeve. He looked lonely even when he was sleeping. Naomi looked toward Ethan for a brief moment before brushing a loose curl away from Lily's face. "Sometimes grown-ups carry heavy things that nobody else can see," she said softly. Lily thought about those words very carefully. Then she slipped her tiny hand into her mother's and quietly walked out of the library without another sound. As the door clicked shut behind them, Ethan remained motionless beneath the blanket. But for the first time in many years, the silence inside the mansion no longer felt empty. It felt as though one small child had somehow filled it with something money had never been able to buy. After another few quiet minutes, Ethan heard the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner moving farther down the west hallway. Naomi had returned to her work, and the library once again settled into complete silence. Slowly, Ethan opened his eyes. He did not move immediately. Instead, He stared at the ceiling while the soft gray blanket still rested across his legs. The room looked exactly the same as it had half an hour earlier, yet somehow everything felt different. His reading glasses sat neatly on the side table instead of balancing dangerously on the edge of the cushion. The sunlight no longer shone directly into his face because someone much too small to reach had still managed to shift the heavy curtain just enough. None of those details had happened by accident. They had happened because a little girl believed a stranger deserved comfort. Ethan sat up slowly and ran one hand across the knitted blanket. The familiar texture triggered another memory he had spent years refusing to revisit. When he was 8 years old, his mother had wrapped that very blanket around his shoulders during a thunderstorm after finding him asleep beside the fireplace with a book still open in his lap. She had smiled and whispered, "The strongest people still need someone to care if they are warm." After she passed away, Ethan had stored those words somewhere so deep inside himself that he almost forgot they existed. Success had filled every empty hour afterward. Meetings replaced family dinners. Contracts replaced conversations. Profits replaced celebrations. Somewhere along the way, protecting his fortune had become easier than protecting his heart. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime butler, Charles Bennett, stepped quietly into the library. At 64, Charles had served the Blackwood family for more than 3 decades. He immediately noticed Ethan sitting beneath the blanket and paused with a puzzled smile. "I do not believe I have ever seen you use that blanket voluntarily, sir," he said politely. Ethan looked down for a moment before answering. "I did not put it there." Charles raised an eyebrow, but remained respectfully silent. Ethan stood, folded the blanket carefully, and placed it exactly where Lily had found it. Then he walked toward the large security monitor built discreetly into the library cabinet. With a few taps, the recording from the hidden cameras began replaying. Charles watched beside him as Lily quietly entered the room, admired the books without touching them, struggled with the oversized blanket, carefully moved the reading glasses, and stretched with all her strength just to block the afternoon sunlight. Neither man spoke while the recording continued. When Lily whispered, "Now you will not get cold," Charles quietly cleared his throat and looked away, pretending to admire a painting on the opposite wall. Ethan noticed. "You have seen many employees come through this house," he said without taking his eyes off the screen. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Charles answered honestly, "No, sir. Children usually think about themselves first." That little girl thought only about someone else. Ethan remained silent for another long moment before the recording reached the point where Naomi gently took Lily's hand. They disappeared through the library door together, leaving behind nothing except a folded curtain, a blanket, and a room somehow transformed by kindness. Ethan replayed the final 30 seconds again, then once more. By the third viewing, he no longer watched to confirm what happened. He watched because he could not understand how someone so young had reminded him of the person he used to be before fear quietly convinced him that generosity always came with a price. For the first time in many years, Ethan found himself wondering whether the greatest fortune he had discovered had never been hidden inside a business deal at all, but inside the heart of a 3-year-old child who had expected absolutely nothing in return. The next morning arrived with crisp autumn air drifting across the Blackwood estate, but Ethan's routine felt strangely unfamiliar. For years he had started every day the same way, reviewing financial reports over black coffee before the first executive meeting. That morning, however, he found himself looking toward the front driveway instead of the numbers displayed on his tablet. At exactly 7:45, Naomi's modest sedan pulled through the security gate. Moments later, she stepped out carrying her cleaning supplies while Lily climbed carefully from the back seat, holding a small pink backpack almost as large as her tiny shoulders. Ethan watched from his office window without saying a word. He was no longer searching for signs of dishonesty. Instead, he found himself wondering how kindness could appear so naturally inside someone so young. Throughout the morning, he quietly observed the security cameras again, not out of suspicion but curiosity. Lily spent nearly an hour in the employee lounge drawing pictures with a box of well-used crayons that Naomi always carried for unexpected daycare closures. She happily shared every color with another employee's grandson who had come to visit his grandfather during school break. When only one blue crayon remained, Lily handed it. to the older boy first and smiled as though giving something away made her happier than keeping it. Later, she helped gather scattered coloring pages after a gust of wind from an opening door sent them sliding across the floor. No adult asked her to help. She simply did. Around lunchtime, Ethan left his office and walked through the mansion without announcing himself. The household staff immediately straightened their posture as he passed, expecting instructions or questions. Instead, he quietly entered the sunroom where Lily sat alone at a small table coloring a picture of a tree beside a bright yellow house. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly before a cheerful smile spread across her face. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said politely. Ethan realized she had spoken to him with exactly the same warmth she offered every gardener, cook, and housekeeper. There was no fear in her voice, no excitement over his wealth, only simple kindness. "Good morning, Lily," he replied, taking the chair across from her. "What are you drawing?" She turned the paper toward him proudly. "This is a happy house because everybody smiles when they come home." Ethan studied the picture. Every window contained a smiling face. Even the little dog in the front yard appeared to be smiling. "Who lives there?" he asked. Lily pointed to each figure one by one. A mommy, a little girl, a puppy, and... She paused before tapping the tallest person in the center. "A daddy." Ethan noticed there was no second adult standing beside the mother. "Does your daddy live there too?" he asked gently. Lily's smile softened, but it did not disappear. She slowly shook her head. "I have never met him. Mommy says sometimes people cannot stay, but that does not mean we stop being kind." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Lily continued coloring without sadness, carefully filling the father's shirt with bright green instead of the brown crayon lying closer to her hand. "If I ever meet him," she said innocently, "I hope somebody was nice to him too." Ethan lowered his eyes to the drawing, suddenly unable to find an immediate reply. For years he had measured people by what they owned, what they achieved, or what they could offer. Yet across the table sat a 3-year-old little girl who measured people by something infinitely smaller and infinitely greater at the same time. In that quiet sunroom, Ethan realized the lesson he thought he was teaching had slowly become the lesson he desperately needed to learn. That afternoon, Ethan asked Naomi if she could spare a few minutes after finishing her work. The request alone made her uneasy. During the short walk toward his private office, dozens of possibilities rushed through her mind. Had Lily accidentally broken something? Had bringing her daughter to work finally become too much? She quietly reminded herself to stay calm as she gently knocked on the office door. "Come in," Ethan said. Naomi stepped inside, holding Lily's small hand. The office overlooked the entire estate, its floor-to-ceiling windows filling the room with warm afternoon light. Ethan stood beside the window for a moment before turning toward them. His expression remained composed, yet there was a softness in his eyes Naomi had never noticed before. "Please have a seat," he said. Naomi hesitated before sitting, while Lily climbed onto the chair beside her, swinging her little legs without making a sound. Ethan remained standing for another few seconds as though choosing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "There is something I need to tell both of you." Naomi instinctively straightened. "If this is about Lily being here, I understand. I know it is not ideal, and I promise I will find another arrangement if necessary." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No, this is not about a complaint." He looked directly at Lily before continuing. "Yesterday afternoon, I was not actually asleep." Naomi blinked in confusion. Lily tilted her head. "You were pretending?" she asked with complete innocence. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, I wanted to see what would happen if someone believed nobody was watching." Naomi's face immediately filled with embarrassment. "I am so sorry if she disturbed you." "She did the opposite," Ethan replied quietly. He walked toward his desk, opened a tablet, and replayed a short portion of the security recording. Naomi watched in silence as Lily struggled to pull the blanket across the room, carefully placed the reading glasses on the table, and stretched to move the curtain just enough to block the sunlight. Tears quietly gathered in Naomi's eyes before the recording had even finished. She looked down at her daughter and gently brushed a hand across her hair. "I did not know she did all of that," she whispered. Ethan's voice became noticeably softer. "Neither did she. She believed I would never know." The room fell silent. Ethan slowly lowered himself until he was kneeling at Lily's eye level. For perhaps the first time in years, One of the wealthiest men in the country spoke without the confidence of a billionaire or the authority of a chief executive. He spoke simply as a human being. "Lily," he said gently, "why were you so kind to me?" The little girl looked surprised by the question itself. "Because you looked tired," she answered as though the explanation required nothing more. "And Mommy says when people are tired or sad, maybe they just need somebody to be nice first." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Even if they are strangers?" Lily smiled with the simple certainty only a child could possess. "Everybody is a stranger until somebody is kind." The words settled over the room with extraordinary quiet. Naomi lowered her head, wiping away a tear she could no longer hide. Ethan remained where he was, unable to speak for several long seconds. He had spent years building companies worth billions of dollars, negotiating deals with world leaders, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet nothing anyone had ever said in a boardroom had reached his heart the way one little sentence from a 3-year-old girl had. In that moment, Ethan understood that the test had never revealed Lily's character. It had exposed the walls surrounding his own heart, and one innocent child had quietly begun tearing them down without even realizing it. After Naomi and Lily left the office, Ethan remained standing beside the window long after the sun had begun slipping behind the distant oak trees. The conversation replayed endlessly in his mind. Everybody is a stranger until somebody is kind. Such simple words should not have carried so much weight, yet they refused to leave him. Early the next morning, he quietly asked Charles to gather employment records and payroll files. The older butler returned with a neatly organized folder containing Naomi's application, work history, and references. Every previous employer described her the same way: dependable, honest, hardworking, never late, never complained. Ethan continued reading until he reached the section detailing her emergency contact. There was only one name listed: an elderly aunt living nearly 200 miles away. No spouse, no partner, no immediate family nearby. Curious, Ethan asked Charles one more question. "Has she ever requested special treatment?" Charles answered without hesitation. "Never, sir. In fact, she often refuses help unless someone insists. Last winter, one of the kitchen staff tried to collect money after Lily became ill. Naomi thanked everyone but quietly returned every dollar the following week after working extra shifts." Ethan closed the folder slowly. Everything he learned confirmed what the little girl had already shown him. Their kindness was not something performed when people were watching. It was simply who they were. Later that afternoon, Ethan invited Naomi back to his office once again. She entered cautiously, uncertain what awaited her this time. Lily stood beside her, holding the same pink backpack against her shoulder. Ethan greeted them with a warm smile that immediately eased some of Naomi's nervousness. He slid a single envelope across the desk. "This is not a bonus," he said before she could speak. "And it is not charity." Naomi carefully opened the envelope, her eyes widening as she read the documents inside. It contained a promotion to estate operations manager, a substantial salary increase, comprehensive health insurance for both her and Lily, flexible scheduling whenever childcare was unavailable, and a fully funded education savings plan established in Lily's name. Naomi looked up in complete disbelief. "Mr. Blackwood, this is far too much. I've not done anything to deserve this." Ethan smiled softly before looking toward Lily. "Actually, both of you have." Lily looked between the adults with adorable confusion. "Does this mean Mommy is not in trouble?" she asked. Ethan laughed quietly, perhaps more sincerely than he had laughed in years. Quite the opposite. He reached into his desk drawer and removed a small silver key attached to a wooden keychain carved into the shape of a tiny house. "There is a guest cottage on the edge of the estate that has been empty for years," he explained. "If you choose to accept it, you and your mother may live there while saving for your future. There will be no rent." Naomi covered her mouth, overwhelmed by emotion. Before she could answer, Lily climbed down from her chair and walked over to Ethan. She reached out her tiny arms, giving him a gentle hug around his waist. "Thank you for helping my mommy," she whispered. Ethan carefully returned the embrace, his eyes growing unexpectedly wet once again. In that quiet office, surrounded by polished wood, framed achievements, and symbols of extraordinary wealth, he finally understood something that had escaped him for decades. Money could purchase comfort, security, and success, But only kindness had the power to transform a house into a home and strangers into something that felt remarkably like family. 1 year later, the Blackwood estate no longer felt like the silent mansion everyone remembered. Laughter drifted through the gardens on warm Saturday mornings. Fresh flowers appeared in the library every Monday because Lily insisted every room deserved something alive inside it. The employees smiled more often, lingering to share coffee before beginning their work because the atmosphere had quietly changed from one of careful professionalism to genuine belonging. Naomi had transformed the daily operations of the estate with the same quiet dedication she had once brought to every housekeeping task. Under her leadership, the staff felt respected, new employees were welcomed with patience instead of pressure, and Ethan noticed something remarkable. Productivity improved not because people feared disappointing him, but because they genuinely cared about the place they worked. It was a lesson no business school had ever taught him. On a cool autumn evening, almost exactly 1 year after the afternoon he pretended to sleep on the library sofa, Ethan sat beside the fireplace once again. This time he was fully awake, holding an illustrated storybook while Lily, now 4 years old, sat comfortably beside him beneath the same gray knitted blanket she had once struggled to pull across his legs. Every few pages, she stopped him with curious questions about the characters, and Ethan answered each one with patient enthusiasm. Across the room, Naomi looked up from organizing paperwork and quietly smiled at the sight before returning to her work. She no longer worried every day about choosing between paying rent and buying groceries. She no longer feared unexpected daycare closures or impossible financial decisions. Stability had replaced uncertainty, but gratitude had never replaced humility. When the story ended, Lily closed the book and leaned gently against Ethan's shoulder. "Mr. Ethan," she asked softly, "do you still work too much?" He laughed, the familiar sound now warm instead of restrained. "Sometimes," he admitted. Lily nodded wisely. "Then you should remember to rest, because tired people need kindness." Ethan smiled, recognizing his own lesson reflected back to him once again. "I will remember," he promised. As evening settled outside, Charles entered the library carrying a tray with hot chocolate for Lily and coffee for the adults. He paused for a moment, quietly observing the room. The once lonely billionaire was discussing fairy tale dragons with a little girl who still believed every flower deserved a compliment. Naomi was reviewing schedules with complete confidence. The fire glowed warmly beneath family photographs that now included smiling pictures of all three of them together at community charity events, holiday dinners, and school celebrations. Charles quietly realized the greatest transformation inside the estate had never been the renovated guest cottage, the improved staff culture, or the charitable foundation Ethan had recently established to support single parents pursuing stable careers. It was the change inside one man's heart. Ethan glanced toward the old leather sofa where he had once pretended to sleep, remembering how certain he had been that every act of kindness carried a hidden motive. Instead, one small child had unknowingly given him something beyond measure. She had reminded him that trust is not built through perfect tests, but through ordinary moments when compassion appears without expectation. Looking at Lily, who had already begun yawning beneath the familiar blanket, Ethan quietly understood that the richest investment he had ever made was not measured in dollars, markets, or companies. It began with a little girl who believed a tired stranger deserved to be warm, and it ended with a home where kindness became the greatest inheritance anyone could ever leave behind.